what happens in the legal side of things for the Trumpster. Let's talk to our friend Andy McCarthy of National Review and Fox News. Andy, great to have you. Just kind of give us your state of play, if you would, on what happens now. So he's got the money. What are the next steps, and what are the chances that he ends up getting out of this thing somehow?
Well, I think it's going to take a long time. I mean, the next steps really are the appeal. I mean, he's got 10 days to put together this bond, but I don't think that's going to be an issue for him. So that'll be kind of uneventful, I think, by the time it happens. But what that means is Tish James cannot do anything to enforce the judgment until the appeal is run. I suspect that that Trump will get a significant reduction in the disgorgement fine on appeal, but that may take over a year. So, I think this chapter, once he posts this bond, this chapter is done, other than, Democrats talking about that he's been found by a court to be a fraudulent businessman.
All right, so let's go to the Alvin Bragg case, Andy. And by the way, going to go ahead and say your Mets are dead before the first pitch is even thrown tomorrow. Sorry to have to take a shot at you, and sorry for everybody out in New York who's still a little bit optimistic.
I thought it was bad enough. It was bad enough opening day was getting rained out. Now you're raining on my parade.
I know. Well, there are so few days where Mets fans can be optimistic. I hate to take one away from you like this. April 15th, I think, right? Isn't it the new trial date where they're going to start with the jury selection?
Correct.
How long does this trial, in your mind, take? Sorry, the second part of that is, we had you on when this happened a year ago, and we did a big breakdown on how unbelievably legally tenuous this entire theory is of Alvin Bragg. What are the odds that this thing even holds up, even after the trial verdict comes in, as the appellate process plays itself out too? Kind of assess this case from your knowledge as a former U.S. attorney in New York.
So I think that they're estimating, Clay, that the case is going to take 4 to 6 weeks. I think that's kind of like the outer margin, in my experience, of where lawyers can accurately predict how long a case is going to take. Usually if it gets outside of 6 weeks, they're kind of telling you that they have no idea how long it's going to take. But let's take them at their word, figure they can get a jury reasonably quickly.
Sorry to cut you off. How long will you think it'll take to seat a jury?
I don't. I had a terrorism case years ago. It took us 3 weeks to seat a jury.
Yeah.
So, and Trump's a lot. This is a very different kind of case. But I mean, Trump in Manhattan. That's a tough place to get a fair jury. But assuming they can do that, let's say somewhere between 3 days and 2 weeks, right? And by the way, I should say they're going to sit 4 days a week and take off Wednesdays. So that's the schedule. So I think the thing is he's got a high chance of getting convicted here, even though it's a nonsense case, because I think the things that make the case very weak may not be as apparent to the jury because it's a lot of legal argument. Like, for example, it goes to whether Bragg has authority to do what he's trying to do here, although he's not talking about it, which is to enforce federal campaign finance law under circumstances where the two federal agencies that actually have jurisdiction to do that looked at this and decided not to take any enforcement action against Trump. So you got Bragg kind of making up his own federal campaign finance standards as he goes along. That's an argument to me that plays much better on appeal than it will in front of the jury. In front of the jury, you're going to get, Stormy Daniels and hush money and Trump's bookkeeping and Michael Cohen. That's the case. And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of legal arguments that ought to knock this out, like the statute of limitations. This really ought to just be a straight one transaction misdemeanor prosecution at best. If it were, the statute of limitations would have run in 2019 because it's only a 2-year statute. He's trying to make it a felony by saying that Trump was trying to conceal a campaign finance violation, even though he doesn't have jurisdiction to do that. And instead of trying it as one felony like any normal prosecutor would do if you were going to do that kind of thing, he's made it 34 felonies by taking every invoice, every check that was cut, and every bookkeeping entry as a separate 4-year felony, which is the Justice Department specifically tells prosecutors not to do. So there's a lot wrong with this case.
Andy, what do you think happens, assuming that you're seeing this the way that it plays out? What happens if they get a guilty verdict in New York? I mean, then we start to get to this really crazy place of, okay, they got a guilty verdict, it's a felony, and then what?
Well, it's a good question because I think I've always thought that this was such a BS case that I didn't know how much it really hurt him to get convicted here. And what's happened in the interim, Buck, is that New York seems like it's gamed against Trump. So I think it may be even less persuasive to people if he gets convicted here.
But I mean in the punishment phase, Andy, not the politics of it. Like, what's the punishment?
No, look, it's every count is 4 years, so statutorily it's over a century, right? But it's a
That's
nonviolent
completely
crime.
insane.
It's crazy. No, it's nuts. But it's in New York, you got violent crime that doesn't get prosecuted or gets pled down to felonies and serious criminals walking the streets. Hard to believe that I have a voice in the back of my head saying, did you believe that a judge would impose a $454 million judgment in a case with no fraud?
Well, Andy, this is my point. I know where you're going. It feels like nothing can be hard to believe anymore about this process.
Yeah, no, it's fair. It's fair enough. I mean, this should be no one, not just Trump. No one should do an hour in prison for this case, and that's the way it should go. And if you took Trump's name out of it and you just said somebody gets convicted of a falsification of business records crime in New York, of all places, where you can't even get people who do slashings on the subway convicted half the time, then he should get. It should be it's a nonviolent misdemeanor type crime, first offender. That shouldn't even be prosecuted in New York, but it certainly should be no jail time.
So it should be like a community service thing, basically, like pay a $500 fine in community service.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
the
And
other
I think
cases.
it wouldn't even be prosecuted for anyone else.
For the other cases, so let's say they get this case done, they get some sort of verdict in it. Given what's going on with the Supreme Court.
Do you want to keep Andy and go to other cases?
Andy, can you do a couple more minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Your Mets aren't on right now, are
Yeah,
they?
yeah.
So we can keep them. We'll keep Andy McCarthy here from National Review and Fox for a little more. Let's get into the other cases, dive into them.
Welcome back in, Clay Travis, Buck Sexton Show. Andy McCarthy with us here, breaking down the absolute latest on the Trump legal machinations. And the question I was going to ask as we were going to break there, Andy, was how would you assess the likelihood that we get a verdict anywhere other than New York City, given what's going on with the Supreme Court, the complexities of South Florida, obviously what's going on with Fanny Willis, and the pause that's going on in D.C. right now? What are the chances more than one case gets a verdict?
Clay, I would have said just one a couple of months ago, but, one of the things that Jack Smith, the special counsel's prosecutor, said, by and by when they were saying something to the judge in one of the proceedings in Florida, is that they don't think the so-called 60-day rule that the Justice Department supposedly follows is applicable to Trump. And I think that was a way of saying that they think even if it gets after Labor Day, they would try to start a trial if a judge would let them. So I think
sounds like pretty astute analysis to me, Andy.
Well,
This is what I've been saying. I've been saying they don't care. They're just going to, unless there's a law that could stop them, they're going to bring the case whenever they can bring it.
Yeah, well, why else would you say that, right? There's no good reason to say it unless you're intending to try them starting in September.
Isn't the argument that they're making
right
also that rule, Andy, that the rule in general, correct me if I'm misreading this or misremembering it, but that it has to do with when you indict someone, not with when you bring the case?
Yeah, so...
Which is utterly crazy, by the way, of all the arguments they make.
Yeah, but, it's an amazing argument because they keep saying that it's of great public interest that he gets convicted before Election Day. And then when they were asked about the 60-day rule, they say, well, that doesn't apply when someone's already been indicted because everybody knows all about it already. So there's nothing that, this isn't something that's going to jolt the electorate. And my question then is, then what's the point of trying him before Election Day? If everybody knows about all this already and they can read the charges and it's very public, then what's the big haste to have a trial before Election Day?
I think that's a fabulous question that is being asked. Fanny Willis. I'm going to keep calling her Fanny. But is she done? What should happen to her based on your knowledge of procedures and what your analysis of the judge there, McAfee, his case? Obviously, it's being appealed in Georgia. What should happen? What will happen in your mind based on those circumstances?
Well, there's a law and there's like practical reality. The law is an appellate court should look at what McAfee did and say it doesn't make any sense to get rid of Wade and not to get rid of Willis.
Right.
Because there's an odor of dishonesty hanging over the case. It's still hanging over because of what she did with him. So that's the law. I mean, she should be out. Then there's practical reality. If I was Trump and I was like prioritizing what things I should spend money on in my defense, I'd send a limo to her house every day to make sure she gets to work because she's the best thing he's got going in that case.
It's astonishing. Andy, we haven't asked you since we got you for a little bit more. Florida, the Florida case, is that the one that you think is the least likely to come to anything before the election?
Yeah, and it's also, Buck, I think we talked about this before, but it's just because of how hard it is to hash through all the classified information issues. In federal law, you have to rule on the admissibility of all the classified evidence before the trial, so it's like having a pretrial trial of the trial, and you're allowed to appeal.
My understanding is that they've been trying to say, if you're going to try to convict Donald Trump for this stuff, the jury has to be able to see how super secret sensitive the things are, and they're fighting that. And I know about this just from the old days in the agency and stuff. I think they call it gray mailing, right? When you are trying to use the classification. But in this case, I think it's very valid because the whole point is, well, this isn't just stuff that a president could take. It's super secret. How could a jury convict a guy for super secret information? They're not allowed to know if it's super secret or not.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I would point out that the Lawfare campaign would have a lot more credibility if they had done one case. If they had done the Florida case, gotten rid of all the classified documents counts, and just said, look, we're going to do this as a fast and nasty on Trump's obstruction of the grand jury, where it wouldn't matter what the classified documents said because the only crime would be, did he lie about whether he turned over all of the documents that had classified markings on them? It wouldn't even matter what the substance of the documents were. You could have done that case in 2 weeks, and it's the strongest case against him. And instead, what they decided to do was throw everything they could possibly think of at him. And as a result, with 36 classified information counts and SEPA litigation, you're not going to get the case to trial.
Andy, what are we not talking about that we should be? Maybe that's on the horizon that you're like, boy, this could be a big issue in these legal proceedings as they go forward. Is there anything out there that you think people are missing or that we aren't talking about that could be significant?
I think it's that we talk about the cases one at a time. And to me, the due process violation is the strategy to throw 4 trials at him under circumstances where these cases are so complex that in an ordinary defendant's case, you would get over a year to get prepared for trial. And they're not only, lining him up for 4 cases, they're making it impossible for him to prepare adequately for any one because of the quantity that they've thrown at him. I think our tendency is, as we've gone through it, because this is the only way you can go through it sensibly, is to go through each case. But I think sometimes we don't realize the cumulative effect of this is unbelievable, and it will become unbelievable to people when they realize that in criminal trials, a defendant has to be present in court every day, every moment of the case. So you're talking about taking the Republican nominee off the campaign trail and locking him in a courtroom basically for somewhere between 3 and 9 months, depending on, how efficient they can push these cases through.
Unbelievable stuff. Andy's piece, his latest, is up at nationalreview.com, and look for him to be popping up on Fox, but also, of course, here on the Clay and Buck Show. Andy, we appreciate you. Good luck to your downtrodden Mets.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate you being with us.